May 4th, 1945. The Tangermünde Bridge over the Elbe River no longer existed in any conventional sense. What remained was a mangled skeleton of steel trusses and fractured concrete, blown apart on April 12th by retreating Wehrmacht engineers to delay the American advance. Now, 3 weeks later, that destruction had become something else entirely. It was the last crossing for 50 kilometers in either direction, a single narrow pathway of twisted girders and shattered roadway, suspended above the slow, cold water of the Elbe. The structure groaned under weight it had never been designed to bear. Thousands of boots moved across it in single file, day and night, as the final formations of a collapsing army crossed from one world into another. On the eastern bank, German military police struggled to maintain order among a mass that no longer resembled a fighting force. Officers shouted commands out of habit more than expectation. Units that had once maneuvered with parade ground precision now advanced as a human column, stripped of tactical spacing, artillery support, and any illusion of coordinated resistance. Vehicles were abandoned kilometers back, engines silent for lack of fuel. Heavy weapons lay smashed beside roads where they had been deliberately destroyed to prevent delay. The Wehrmacht, once the most disciplined military machine in Europe, was dissolving into motion driven by a single calculation. On the western bank, Captain William Patterson of the 4th Infantry Regiment, 102nd Infantry Division, raised his field glasses and stared at the crossing in silence. He had reached the Elbe 2 weeks earlier, part of the American advance that had halted precisely on this river, according to the agreements made at Yalta. The line was clear. No further advance eastward. The war, as far as American planners were concerned, was entering its final administrative phase. What Patterson saw unfolding before him had not appeared in any operational estimate. The column did not end. Soldiers in field gray uniforms moved beside civilians pushing carts, wheelbarrows, baby carriages. Wounded men were supported by comrades who themselves barely walked. Teenagers in Volkssturm armbands marched next to elderly reservists with World War I rifles slung over their shoulders. There was no sign of panic, no stampede. The movement was steady, deliberate, relentless. It was not retreat. It was migration. American signals intelligence had already intercepted fragments of the explanation. Messages moving through shattered German command networks spoke of units abandoning positions without orders, of equipment destroyed not under enemy pressure but to increase speed. Reports from the 102nd Infantry Division sector described entire formations approaching American lines without tactical deployment, displaying white flags, requesting surrender terms while still fully armed. By late April, estimates placed nearly 100,000 German soldiers and civilians attempting to cross the Elbe westward through destroyed infrastructure. The bridge at Tangermünde had become the focal point of something unprecedented. No Allied planner had anticipated it. This was not a local collapse, not an isolated surrender triggered by encirclement or defeat in battle. It was voluntary, mass, and deliberate. The largest movement of enemy forces seeking captivity from a specific opponent in Western military history was forming in full view of American lines. The urgency driving the German column had nothing to do with maneuver or doctrine. It was not based on hope of counterattack or belief in a negotiated peace. The calculation was simpler, more brutal, and more fundamental. Survival. By late April 1945, the strategic situation for Germany was beyond recovery. Soviet forces under Marshal Georgy Zhukov's First Belarusian Front and Marshal Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front were advancing with overwhelming superiority. In many sectors, 20 Soviet divisions faced each remaining German division still capable of organized resistance. The Red Army was advancing up to 30 kilometers per day. German formations on foot managed barely 10 to 15 kilometers under optimal conditions. Entire civilian populations were already on the move. Approximately 8 million German civilians were fleeing westward from East Prussia, Silesia, and Pomerania, driven ahead of the Soviet advance. German military intelligence, still functioning in fragments, had intercepted Soviet communications projecting prisoner handling and labor allocations. The conclusions circulated quietly among officers and men alike. Of every 100 German soldiers captured by the Red Army, fewer than 40 were statistically expected to survive long enough to return home. Later records would suggest the reality was even more severe. This was not rumor. It was arithmetic. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel's final strategic assessments, captured intact after Germany's surrender, contained a single directive underlined in heavy pencil. Maximum German forces must reach Western Allied lines before Soviet encirclement completes. This was not defeatism. It was recognition of a reality that no ideology could override. Surrender to the Americans meant probable survival. Capture by Soviet forces meant probable death. The Yalta agreements had already determined occupation zones. In theory, German forces had no choice in the matter. In practice, geography still offered a narrow window. American units had halted on the Elbe as agreed. If German soldiers could cross that river before Soviet forces arrived from the east, they would enter American custody. The race was not for victory, territory, or honor. It was for the basic human possibility of surviving captivity. The Wehrmacht's collapse reflected that understanding with remarkable clarity. SS blocking detachments attempted to halt the westward movement, enforcing orders to hold positions or face execution. In several sectors, German soldiers fought, through their own rear security units, to continue west. Equipment was abandoned, not because it was damaged, but because it slowed movement. Even elite Waffen-SS units destroyed operational Tiger tanks when fuel ran low, choosing speed over firepower. From the American side of the river, the phenomenon was both baffling and alarming. The United States Army was prepared to accept prisoners. It was not prepared to absorb an entire enemy army in motion. Each American infantry division possessed attached military police battalions, field kitchens capable of feeding approximately 15,000 men daily, mobile medical units with surgical capability, and supply stockpiles that reflected American industrial capacity. These systems were designed for tens of thousands of prisoners, not hundreds of thousands arriving within days. Major James Morrison, operations officer of the 102nd Infantry Division, had studied mass surrender logistics following the Ruhr Pocket earlier in April, where approximately 325,000 German troops had surrendered after the collapse of Army Group B. His calculations were precise and deeply troubling. Processing 1,000 prisoners required roughly 3 tons of food per day, 5,000 gallons of water, medical screening for typhus and dysentery, delousing stations, and administrative documentation that generated 12 separate forms per individual. Geneva Convention requirements mandated caloric intakes of 2,800 calories for working prisoners and 2,000 for non-working. These figures were not abstract. They were the line between order and catastrophe when handling desperate humanity. What was now approaching the Elbe dwarfed the Ruhr surrender. Intelligence estimates placed approximately 1.2 million German personnel east of the river as of April 25th. Of these, around 300,000 remained in organized combat units. Another 400,000 were support personnel. The remaining 500,000 were scattered Wehrmacht and Volkssturm members already fleeing westward independently. Soviet mechanized spearheads could close the distance in hours. The window for escape was shrinking by the day. The bridge at Tangermünde, destroyed as a weapon of war, had become something else entirely. It was no longer a military objective. It was a threshold. On one side lay Soviet captivity, statistical annihilation, and uncertainty measured in years of forced labor, disease, and attrition. On the other lay American custody, governed by law, logistics, and an enemy whose reputation for treatment of prisoners had spread with extraordinary speed through collapsing German ranks. As Captain Patterson lowered his binoculars, He understood that the war had entered a phase no doctrine had prepared him for. The enemy was no longer fighting. It was choosing. The assumption that had sustained Germany's war effort for 6 years, that sacrifice, endurance, and obedience could still shape outcomes, had collapsed into a single human imperative. Reach the Americans. Cross the river. Live. The decision driving the German movement toward the Elbe was not born in desperation alone. It was sustained by comparison. By the final weeks of April 1945, the difference between American and Soviet captivity was no longer an abstraction argued by propaganda ministries. It was a system-level contrast, measured in calories, mortality rates, medical capacity, and time. German soldiers did not need ideology to understand it. They needed arithmetic. For months, fragments of reliable information had filtered westward through retreating units. Wounded men evacuated from the Eastern Front, and intercepted communications quietly circulated among officers. German military intelligence, though shattered by bombing and operational collapse, still compiled reports. Some were based on Soviet radio traffic. Others came from first-hand observation by officers who had escaped encirclement. The conclusions converged with terrifying consistency. Captured by the Red Army, a German soldier entered a system not designed for custody, but for extraction. Soviet prisoner doctrine prioritized labor, punishment, and ideological retribution over preservation. The Red Army itself was advancing faster than its supply network could sustain. Feeding millions of prisoners was never a priority. In 1945, Soviet logistical systems struggled to provide their own frontline units with more than subsistence rations. Prisoners received what remained. German intelligence projections estimated survival rates based on prior campaigns. Of every 100 German soldiers captured by Soviet forces in 1944 and early 1945, fewer than 40 were expected to survive captivity long enough to return home. Those numbers were not exaggerated. They were derived from observed attrition in camps, labor detachments, and transit columns. Disease, malnutrition, exposure, and violence compounded into predictable outcomes. American captivity represented a different system entirely. It was bureaucratic, inflexible, and often overwhelmed, but it was governed by law. The United States Army adhered to the Geneva Convention, not out of sentiment, but doctrine. Prisoners were not viewed as expendable labor or ideological enemies. They were a logistical problem to be managed, recorded, fed, treated, and contained. That difference was visible long before the war's end. The surrender of Army Group B in the Ruhr Pocket in mid-April 1945 had provided a living demonstration. When Field Marshal Walter Model dissolved his command rather than formally surrender, approximately 325,000 German soldiers gave themselves up to American forces. The processing was imperfect, chaotic, and strained, but the essentials were unmistakable. Prisoners were fed, wounded were treated, guards enforced order rather than vengeance. News of that treatment spread rapidly. American signals intelligence intercepted German radio traffic confirming the effect. Units still fighting in isolated sectors exchanged information about surrender points, food, availability, and medical care. One intercepted transmission from late April reported simply, "Americans honoring Geneva Convention at all collection points. Medical treatment provided. Food distribution confirmed." For soldiers who had lived on starvation rations for weeks, that final phrase mattered most. The Wehrmacht that approached the Elbe in late April and early May was no longer uniform in capability or composition. It represented the full spectrum of Germany's collapse. Elite Waffen-SS formations still possessed operational Tiger and Panther tanks, advanced radios, and trained crews. Regular army divisions had been reduced to battalion strength, their men carrying only personal weapons and a few days' rations. Volkssturm units included boys as young as 14 and men over 60, armed with obsolete rifles or nothing more than armbands. Behind them came auxiliary services and non-combatants. Organization taught construction battalions marched alongside Luftwaffe ground crews who no longer had aircraft. Kriegsmarine personnel from destroyed ports moved inland. Sailors turned infantry by necessity. Female auxiliary staff followed in nervous clusters, acutely aware of what Soviet capture meant for women. The column was not an army. It was a cross-section of a state collapsing into motion. American commanders watching this movement understood only part of its cause. What they could see was discipline without resistance. German units arrived at American lines in formation, officers maintaining bearing even in defeat. They stacked weapons neatly, presented documentation when available, and requested surrender terms. These were not routed remnants fleeing annihilation under fire. They were organized forces choosing captivity while still capable of fighting. The United States Army was structurally prepared for prisoners, but not for this scale. Each American infantry division carried logistical systems designed to sustain itself and process captured enemies. Military police battalions enforced order. Field kitchens provided standardized rations. Medical units offered triage, surgery, and disease control. Supply depots held vast reserves reflecting American industrial output. What they lacked was elasticity. Major James Morrison's calculations for the 102nd Infantry Division reflected the limits clearly. Processing 1,000 prisoners required 3 tons of food daily, 5,000 gallons of water, delousing equipment to prevent typhus, and medical screening for dysentery and malnutrition. Administrative processing alone generated 12 forms per individual, including identity verification, unit assignment, medical status, and security classification. Each prisoner required time, manpower, and space. At peak flow, those numbers collapsed into absurdity. 20,000 Germans were arriving daily at some surrender points. Processing one properly took 20 minutes. The arithmetic failed immediately. Yet the system continued, functioning because American doctrine placed survival ahead of efficiency. When paperwork fell behind, food distribution did not stop. When tents ran out, fields were fenced. When beds were unavailable, blankets were issued. German soldiers approaching the Elbe understood this system through rumor and confirmation. They knew American forces possessed overwhelming logistical capacity. They had seen it in combat. American artillery fired without rationing. American vehicles appeared endlessly. Fuel shortages that paralyzed German units never seemed to affect their enemies. Even now, American divisions held the western bank of the Elbe with supply stockpiles that dwarfed anything Germany could assemble. The comparison with Soviet systems was immediate and merciless. Soviet mechanized spearheads advanced rapidly, but left devastation behind. Refugee columns moved more slowly, often overtaken by armor and artillery. Reports from East Prussia, Silesia, and Pomerania described entire villages emptied, populations displaced or killed. Colonel Günther Reichhelm, intelligence officer under General Walter Wenck, compiled statistics that circulated quietly among German commands. In East Prussia alone, an estimated 300,000 civilians had died during the Soviet advance from exposure, violence, and reprisal. Applied to the millions still fleeing westward, the implications were catastrophic. This was not speculation. It was pattern recognition. By April 20, 1945, the first clear fracture in German obedience appeared. Adolf Hitler ordered General Wenck's 12th Army to attack eastward toward Berlin in a final symbolic effort to relieve the capital. Wenck understood the order was militarily meaningless. His army lacked fuel, ammunition, and air support. Berlin was already encircled. Instead, he made a decision that would define the final weeks of the war. Wenck redirected his army westward. Officially, the maneuver was framed as repositioning. In reality, it was a deliberate attempt to open an escape corridor to American lines. At his headquarters near Balitz, Wenck gathered his commanders and stated the reality without euphemism. The war was lost. Their duty was no longer to ideology or orders that guaranteed annihilation. It was to the soldiers and civilians depending on them. This decision was not unique in impulse, but it was unique in scale. Wenck's intelligence staff had compiled evidence too consistent to ignore. Soviet casualty handling was not improving. Prisoners were not being evacuated humanely. Medical care was minimal to non-existent. For wounded soldiers, capture often meant immediate death. For civilians, it meant exposure, violence, or forced displacement. As German units moved westward under Wenck's protective screen, American observation posts began reporting scenes that violated every principle of military doctrine. Vehicles approached the Elbe with headlights on at night, disregarding blackout rules drilled into German forces since 1939. Units arrived in parade formation. Officers saluted American soldiers. Requests for surrender were transmitted calmly, without pretense. Captain Robert Thornton of the 2nd Armored Division radioed division headquarters on April 24th with a message that captured the moment succinctly. German forces approaching our positions are not attacking. They are displaying white flags and requesting terms. Within days, the trickle became a flood. On April 24th, the U.S. 9th Army processed approximately 3,000 voluntary surrenders. On April 25th, the number rose to 7,000. On April 26th, it exceeded 15,000. These were not battlefield captures. These were intact units choosing captivity while still armed. German soldiers understood the distinction clearly. American captivity meant predictable treatment under law. Soviet captivity meant uncertainty measured in survival probability. That knowledge sustained the westward movement even as SS blocking detachments enforced discipline with executions and roadblocks. Men continued anyway. By the final days of April, the system sustaining the German flight was no longer command structure or ideology. It was information. It moved faster than any army, carried by rumor, intercepted messages, and the testimony of those who had already crossed. The Elbe was no longer a river. It was a line between systems. On one side stood a bureaucracy, strained but intact, capable of feeding, housing, and treating enemies according to law. On the other stood a victorious army that viewed prisoners as a burden, a threat, or a form of repayment for unspeakable losses. German soldiers approaching the Elbe did not romanticize the Americans. They did not expect kindness. They expected survival. That expectation was enough. The first unmistakable fracture in the German war effort did not occur at the front lines, but in the space between orders and obedience. By the third week of April 1945, directives continued to flow from Berlin, but their authority had collapsed. What remained of Germany's command structure issued commands that no longer aligned with reality on the ground, and increasingly, those commands were ignored. On April 20th, Adolf Hitler's final birthday, the Führer issued one of his last operational orders. General Walter Wenck's 12th Army, positioned southwest of Berlin near Balitz, was to advance eastward, break through Soviet encirclement, and relieve the capital. The order was not merely unrealistic, it was delusional. Wenck's forces were understrength, short of fuel, low on ammunition, and facing Soviet formations that outnumbered them several times over. Berlin was already surrounded by Marshal Georgy Zhukov's 1st Belarusian Front and Marshal Ivan Konev's 1st Ukrainian Front. No corridor existed to be reopened. Wenck understood this immediately. His staff understood it. Even junior officers understood it. The question was not whether the order could be carried out, but whether obeying it served any remaining purpose. At his headquarters near Balitz, Wenck assembled his senior commanders. There was no dramatic confrontation, no open defiance. He simply stated what had become undeniable. The war was lost. Berlin could not be saved. Any attack toward the city would end in annihilation, without altering the outcome. Their responsibility, he told them, was no longer to an ideology that demanded sacrifice without meaning, but to the soldiers and civilians already trapped between the advancing Soviet fronts and the Elbe River. The decision Wenck made that day was subtle in form and radical in consequence. He would move west, not east. Officially, the 12th Army would conduct defensive operations to stabilize the front. In practice, it would open and hold an escape corridor toward American lines. It was a calculated act of disobedience that placed human survival above doctrinal loyalty. Colonel Gunther Reichhelm, Wenck's intelligence officer, had prepared the data that made the decision unavoidable. Reports from East Prussia, Silesia, and Pomerania documented patterns that repeated with chilling consistency. Civilians overrun by Soviet forces suffered catastrophic losses. In East Prussia alone, Reichhelm estimated that approximately 300,000 civilians had died during the Soviet advance, from exposure, reprisals, and violence. Military prisoners fared no better. Wounded soldiers were often left untreated. Typhus and dysentery spread unchecked. Those unable to march were frequently executed. Applied to the population now compressed between the Elbe and the Red Army, these statistics pointed toward catastrophe on a continental scale. Millions were at risk. The only variable still open was direction. As Wenck's army shifted westward, the effect was immediate. Units that had been holding positions under orders to fight to the last began disengaging. Defensive lines dissolved not under enemy pressure, but through quiet withdrawal. Soldiers destroyed equipment not because it was damaged, but because it slowed movement. SS blocking detachments attempted to enforce discipline, establishing checkpoints on westbound roads and executing men attempting to flee without authorization. In several documented cases, Wehrmacht units exchanged fire with SS formations to continue moving. American forward observers reported scenes that defied conventional interpretation. German vehicles approached without camouflage, headlights on, in direct violation of every principle of wartime movement. Columns advanced without spacing. Officers maintained formation and discipline, not for combat, but to prevent panic among civilians moving alongside them. The appearance was orderly, almost ceremonial, but the intent was unmistakable. By April 24th, U.S. observation posts along the Elbe were reporting unprecedented contact. German units were not probing defenses or testing American reactions. They were approaching directly, displaying white flags, requesting surrender terms. Captain Robert Thornton of the 2nd Armored Division described the phenomenon in a radio message to headquarters. German forces approaching our positions are not attacking. They are requesting captivity. Within hours, the trickle became a flood. The U.S. 9th Army processed approximately 3,000 voluntary surrenders on April 24th. On April 25th, the number rose to 7,000. On April 26th, it exceeded 15,000. These figures did not include civilians, wounded men unable to walk, or those still fighting through SS-controlled areas to reach American lines. This pattern had precedent. Earlier in April, the Ruhr Pocket had demonstrated what happened when German forces encountered American captivity. When Field Marshal Walter Model dissolved Army Group B rather than formally surrender, approximately 325,000 German soldiers laid down their arms. The treatment they received spread rapidly through German communication channels. Food distribution, medical care, protection from displaced persons seeking revenge. The experience contradicted everything Nazi propaganda had promised. American signals intelligence intercepted German radio traffic reflecting the shift. On April 27th, the commander of the 3rd Panzer Corps transmitted a message that would have been unthinkable months earlier. Americans honoring Geneva Convention at all collection points. Medical treatment provided. Food distribution confirmed. For German soldiers who had been on starvation rations for weeks, that final detail mattered more than ideology. Hunger had stripped propaganda of its power. Survival restored clarity. The psychological collapse accelerated. Units still technically combat effective began abandoning defensive positions en masse. Officers burned documents rather than delay movement. Entire formations dissolved as men made individual decisions to flee west. The Wehrmacht did not surrender as an institution. It fragmented into millions of personal calculations, each converging on the same conclusion. Reaching American lines, however, was not simply a matter of walking west. Between the fleeing masses and the Elbe lay some of the most lethal fighting of the war's final weeks. SS formations remained fanatically loyal, viewing surrender as betrayal rather than survival. Soviet forces, advancing relentlessly from the east, closed corridors with armor, artillery, and air power. The space between the fronts narrowed daily. The most violent expression of this collapse came southeast of Berlin, in the forests near the village of Halbe. There, the remnants of General Theodor Busse's Ninth Army found themselves encircled. Approximately 200,000 soldiers and 40,000 civilians were trapped between Soviet units pressing from all sides. Hitler ordered them to break eastward toward Berlin and link up with the capital's defenders. Busse, like Wenck, understood the order was meaningless. Instead, Busse coordinated with Wenck to attempt a breakout westward toward American lines. It was a decision born not of hope, but of probability. Eastward meant certain destruction. Westward offered a chance, however slim. The breakout began at 2000 hours on April 25, 1945. Leading elements of the 11th SS Panzer Corps used their remaining fuel to punch through Soviet lines near Halbe village. Behind them followed an extraordinary procession. Combat troops marched alongside medical units, administrative personnel, civilian refugees, military dependents, and even regimental bands carrying their instruments. The column stretched nearly 30 kilometers through the Spree forest, a serpentine mass moving through swamps, woods, and narrow tracks. Soviet forces reacted with overwhelming firepower. Katyusha rocket batteries saturated forest paths. Il-2 Sturmovik aircraft strafed columns visible from the air. T-34 tanks crushed defensive positions and the men holding them. Machine gun teams established killing zones at stream crossings where the wounded and exhausted bottlenecked. The forest became a slaughterhouse. Colonel Hans von Luck, commanding remnants of a panzer regiment, later described the scene without embellishment. This was no longer war, he recalled. It was massacre. We kept moving because stopping meant death. Officers shot their own wounded rather than leave them for Soviet capture. The statistics that emerged were catastrophic. Of the approximately 200,000 who began the breakout, only around 40,000 reached Wenck's lines and eventual American captivity. Roughly 60,000 were captured by Soviet forces. Few would survive long-term imprisonment. The remainder vanished into the forest, killed in skirmishes, drowned attempting river crossings, or buried in unmarked graves. The Halbe Forest Cemetery today contains approximately 24,000 graves, most marked simply unknown German soldier. It is one of the largest mass burial sites of the war's final phase, yet even this catastrophe did not halt the westward movement. If anything, it intensified it. Those who escaped carried with them stories that hardened resolve among those still trying to flee. The lesson was clear. Reaching the Americans was not just preferable, it was the only option that offered life. General Wenck's 12th Army now assumed a role no German formation had ever been trained for. It became a shield, not for victory, but for evacuation. His units established strongpoints at key road junctions and river crossings rather than continuous lines, forcing Soviet forces to deploy for deliberate assaults. This bought time measured not in days, but in lives. As April turned to May, the fractures widened. Orders from Berlin continued to arrive. They were no longer obeyed. The Wehrmacht was not defeated in a single blow. It cracked, then shattered, under the weight of a truth its soldiers could no longer ignore. The war was over. Survival now depended on which side received your surrender. By the final days of April 1945, The space between Soviet and American forces had narrowed into a lethal corridor measured in hours. What had begun as organized withdrawal hardened into a race against encirclement, and under that pressure, the last remnants of German command cohesion collapsed entirely. Strategy no longer governed movement. Physics did. Whoever moved faster lived longer. General Walter Wenck's 12th Army now occupied an impossible position. To the east, Soviet spearheads advanced relentlessly, supported by artillery concentrations that dwarfed anything remaining in the German inventory. To the west lay the Elbe River and American lines, immobile by political agreement, yet increasingly aware of the human flood approaching them. Between these forces surged hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians, stripped of protection, dragging the wounded, abandoning equipment, and compressing into road networks never designed for such volume. The pressure manifested most violently in the final breakout attempts east of the Elbe. After the catastrophe at Halbe, Soviet forces tightened their grip. Marshal Zhukov and Marshal Konev coordinated movements designed not merely to defeat remaining German units, but to prevent westward escape altogether. Roads were cut deliberately. River crossings were targeted with artillery. Forest routes were saturated with rockets and air attack. The Red Army possessed overwhelming firepower. Katyusha rocket launchers could blanket entire grid squares in seconds, saturating forests and villages alike. Il-2 Sturmovik aircraft flew low, strafing columns of refugees and retreating soldiers without distinction. Tank units advanced not in cautious formations, but in sweeping arcs designed to overrun movement corridors, rather than engage organized resistance. German formations attempting to hold ground were crushed in minutes. For those still trying to reach Wenck's corridor, the journey became a gauntlet. SS blocking detachments enforced orders to fight to the last. Military police checkpoints turned back columns or opened fire on deserters. In some sectors, German soldiers fought through their own rear security units at night, using darkness to bypass execution squads. Every kilometer westward carried a cost measured in lives. American forward observers began reporting Soviet artillery impacts within audible range by May 1st. The sounds of distant bombardment grew closer daily. The sense of time running out became absolute. Units that had maintained cohesion for weeks now dissolved entirely. Men threw away weapons to move faster. Officers burned maps and documents on the roadside. Vehicles were pushed into ditches to clear roads for foot traffic. The Wehrmacht no longer existed as a fighting institution east of the Elbe. It existed only as motion. Against this backdrop, Wenck's army executed what would later be recognized as one of the most extraordinary humanitarian operations of the war. With approximately 100,000 troops, including the Clausewitz and Scharnhorst divisions, Wenck established a defensive corridor roughly 40 kilometers wide stretching toward the Elbe. His headquarters, set up in a schoolhouse near Fersch, became a coordination center for evacuation rather than combat. Radio traffic flowed constantly. Fragmented German units reported positions, strength, and civilian numbers. Wenck's staff prioritized wounded transport first, then civilians, then organized military formations. Ammunition was rationed strictly. Food stocks were diverted to refugees despite desperate shortages among frontline units. Medical supplies were exhausted within days. Lieutenant Hans Maimann, serving in Wenck's operations section, recorded the scale of the task in his diary. "We estimate 500,000 civilians in our sector, plus remnants of 20 different military units. No food for civilians. Medical supplies exhausted. Ammunition sufficient for perhaps 48 hours of combat. Yet we must hold until all who can be saved reach American lines." Wenck personally visited forward positions, often arriving unannounced, speaking to soldiers who were exhausted, underfed, and often barely trained. Many were teenagers pulled from training schools. Others were elderly Volkssturm conscripts. To these men, Wenck became a symbol of defiance not against the enemy, but against futility. Officers later recalled that his presence alone stabilized positions that should have collapsed within hours. The tactical approach reflected brutal realism. Rather than attempting continuous defensive lines, Wenck established strong points at road junctions, river crossings, and forest exits. Soviet units were forced to deploy artillery and infantry to reduce each position methodically. This bought time at the cost of lives. German rearguards often fought until ammunition was exhausted, then withdrew under cover of darkness or were overrun entirely. By May 3rd, Soviet forces were within artillery range of the Elbe in several sectors. American officers on the western bank could now hear sustained bombardment. The political boundary that had frozen their advance became increasingly difficult to reconcile with what they were witnessing. Thousands were still trying to cross. The focal point of the evacuation became the destroyed Tangermünde Bridge. Wehrmacht engineers had demolished the modern structure on April 12th to slow the American advance. Ironically, its twisted remains now formed the only crossing point for tens of kilometers. The river itself was too wide and fast for mass crossings elsewhere. German engineers began reinforcing the wreckage with timber, cables, and scavenged steel, creating a narrow, single-file pathway across bent girders and fractured concrete. What followed defied precedent. German and American engineers worked simultaneously from opposite banks, reinforcing the same structure while still technically at war. American combat engineers provided tools, timber, and guidance without formal orders. Both sides understood that if the crossing failed, thousands would be trapped east of the river with Soviet forces minutes away. Lieutenant Colonel William Davis of the 102nd Infantry Division later described the moment. German officers saluted us. We saluted back. Their engineers asked ours for equipment to strengthen the bridge. We gave it to them. Everyone understood lives depended on keeping that crossing open. From May 4 to May 7th, the crossing operated continuously. Wehrmacht colonels directed traffic alongside American sergeants. German military police maintained order on the eastern approach, while American MPs controlled the western bank. If chaos erupted, the structure would collapse. Nobody ran. Nobody pushed. The movement remained steady, disciplined by shared fear of what lay behind. An estimated 100,000 people crossed the broken structure in those final days. Soldiers stacked weapons neatly on the western bank. Officers surrendered unit flags formally. An SS general arrived in full dress uniform requesting honorable captivity for his men. Naval officers led sailors who had not seen the sea in months. Female auxiliaries crossed in silence, many weeping openly as American soldiers waved them forward. Civilians formed the most harrowing scenes. Families pushed carts loaded with everything they owned. Children separated from parents were passed hand to hand across the gap. Elderly men and women were carried by strangers. Hospital patients, some still in their beds, were wheeled across by medical staff who refused to abandon them. Master Sergeant James Patterson, supervising the western approach, later wrote that they came in waves, dawn to dusk, then through the night by moonlight. Soldiers stacked rifles like cordwood, women with babies, boys who should have been in school wearing uniforms, old men in armbands. Nobody resisted. They were just grateful to reach our side. As Soviet artillery began landing closer on May 6th, American units quietly repositioned guns to provide counter-battery fire. Officially, the Americans were still at war with Germany and allied with the Soviets. In practice, they were firing to protect Germans crossing into surrender. It was one of the war's strangest moments, enemies cooperating under fire to outrun a third force. At 0241 hours on May 7th, General Alfred Jodl signed Germany's unconditional surrender at Reims. The ceasefire would take effect at 2301 hours on May 8th. That left exactly 45 hours. For those still east of the Elbe, the race became absolute. The 45 hours between the signing of Germany's unconditional surrender at Rams and the moment the ceasefire took effect were among the most consequential of the war. They were not marked by battles or maneuver, but by movement, desperate, relentless, and unarmed. For hundreds of thousands still east of the Elbe, time itself had become the enemy. At American headquarters, the implications were immediately understood. The surrender document signed by General Alfred Jodl at 0241 hours on May 7, 1945, stipulated that all German forces were to cease operations simultaneously at 2301 hours on May 8. The Yalta agreements were explicit. Separate surrenders were forbidden. German units surrendering to Western forces while continuing to fight the Soviets violated inter-Allied commitments. Yet reality on the ground made protocol increasingly irrelevant. German forces were not negotiating surrender terms. They were fleeing annihilation. The distinction mattered. General Dwight D. Eisenhower faced an impossible dilemma. Upholding Allied agreements meant refusing entry to Germans still east of the Elbe once the ceasefire took effect. Enforcing that boundary would condemn tens, perhaps hundreds of thousands, to Soviet captivity. Ignoring it risked diplomatic rupture at the very moment the war in Europe was ending. The solution, unspoken and unofficial, was pragmatic. Any German soldier or civilian who reached American lines before 2301 hours on May 8th would be processed as a prisoner. Those arriving after would, in theory, be subject to repatriation agreements with Soviet forces. In practice, enforcement would vary. This decision transformed the Elbe crossings into a final deadline. The race was no longer measured in days or kilometers, but in hours. The Tangermünde crossing now operated without pause. From May 7th through the afternoon of May 8th, the flow intensified. Entire German units abandoned remaining positions simultaneously. Soldiers threw away equipment to move faster. Officers burned unit records and maps to avoid delay. Trucks were overloaded beyond capacity, then abandoned when engines failed. The Wehrmacht dissolved completely as an institution. What remained were individuals making the same calculation again and again. General Walter Wenck understood what the deadline meant. His 12th Army, already stretched beyond exhaustion, now became the final shield. Wenck positioned his last operational tanks and artillery to delay Soviet advances for hours rather than days. Ammunition was expended not to win ground, but to buy time. Rear guards fought knowing relief would never come. At 1800 hours on May 7th, Wenck issued his final operational order. The wording was precise. The 12th Army has fulfilled its last duty. We have saved all who could be saved. Every commander is now free to seek safety for his men. It was not a surrender. It was a release from obligation, allowing individual units to act according to circumstance rather than doctrine. Wenck himself remained until the end. At approximately 0200 hours on May 8th, he crossed westward near Tangermünde, walking across a damaged railway bridge under intermittent artillery fire. Soviet tanks were already moving into positions his forces had abandoned hours earlier. Of the approximately 200,000 men originally under his command, around 100,000 reached American lines. An estimated 250,000 civilians passed through the corridor his army held. The scenes at the American reception points overwhelmed all remaining administrative capacity. Geneva Convention requirements mandated documentation, medical screening, food distribution, and shelter. Processing one prisoner properly required approximately 20 minutes. At peak flow, more than 20,000 were arriving daily. The system collapsed. Colonel Benjamin Thompson, Chief of Staff for the 16th Airborne Corps, made the decision that defined the moment. Forget the paperwork. Get them fed. Get them deloused. Get medical attention to the wounded. Documentation can wait. Lives cannot. The consequences were immediate and lasting. Families were separated in the chaos. Some never reunited. Soldiers lost connection to their units, complicating casualty accounting for decades. War criminals potentially disappeared into the mass of humanity. Yet the alternative, turning people away, was unthinkable. The medical crisis was acute. American medical units estimated that nearly 30% of surrendering Germans required immediate treatment. Malnutrition was universal after months of starvation rations. Typhus, spread by lice, threatened epidemic proportions. Combat wounds untreated for weeks had become gangrenous. Field hospitals designed to treat dozens now treated hundreds daily. Captain David Miller of the 330th Medical Battalion performed surgery continuously for 72 hours. These were not fresh wounds, he later recalled. These were weeks old, infected, untreated. Men walking on broken bones, shrapnel still embedded, children collapsing from hunger, women with injuries from assault. We treated whoever arrived first. American supply systems, vast by European standards, strained under the load. A single infantry division carried rations for 15,000 men for 7 days. By May 5th, some divisions were feeding more than 60,000 prisoners and civilians simultaneously. Emergency convoys ran continuously from rear depots. C-47 transport aircraft dropped supplies by parachute. The Red Ball Express, which had fueled Patton's race across France, was reactivated to feed surrendered enemies. The irony was unmistakable. American logistics, designed to sustain offensive warfare, now sustained the defeated. At Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, Admiral Karl Dönitz, who had succeeded Hitler as head of state, attempted one final maneuver. On May 4th, he dispatched Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedeburg to negotiate with Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. The proposal was blunt: immediate surrender of all German forces in northwest Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands, allowing maximum evacuation from the east. Montgomery could accept only unconditional surrender to all allies, yet he understood the stakes. In his memoirs, he later wrote that the Germans were not seeking military advantage. They were seeking salvation from Soviet retribution. As soldiers, we could offer honorable captivity. What the Russians offered, God only knows. The ceasefire deadline approached with merciless certainty. Even after Soviet forces reached artillery range of the Elbe on May 6th, the stream of refugees continued. American artillery provided counter-battery fire, technically engaging Soviet units to protect Germans still crossing to surrender. It was an extraordinary moment. Americans and Germans cooperating under fire while still officially enemies. By the time the ceasefire took effect at 2301 hours on May 8th, American forces had processed approximately 1.5 million German military prisoners in the war's final 3 weeks. The 102nd Infantry Division alone accepted the surrender of more than 300,000 enemies, more than the entire German force that invaded Poland in 1939. The recognition came too late for many. Intelligence estimates suggested that approximately 250,000 German soldiers remained east of the Elbe on May 7th. Within 45 hours, roughly 180,000 reached American lines. The remainder entered Soviet captivity with consequences that would echo for decades. The war had ended. The accounting had not. When the guns fell silent at 2301 hours on May 8, 1945, the war in Europe ended on paper. On the ground, its consequences were only beginning to unfold. The mass movement of German soldiers and civilians toward American lines in April and May 1945 did not simply conclude a campaign. It reshaped the demographic, political, and strategic landscape of post-war Europe in ways that neither side fully understood at the time. The immediate result was numerical and stark. Of approximately 3.8 million German prisoners taken into Western Allied custody during and immediately after the war, American and British records indicate that roughly 137,000 died in captivity, a mortality rate of approximately 3.6%. Most deaths occurred from wounds sustained before capture, disease contracted during the chaotic final weeks, or complications from prolonged malnutrition. By June 1945, the monthly death rate in American-administered camps had stabilized below 0.15%. The figures for German prisoners captured by Soviet forces told a different story. Of approximately 3 million German soldiers taken into Red Army custody between 1941 and 1945, at least 1.1 million are believed to have died in captivity. Soviet records officially acknowledge 356,700 deaths, but German post-war research and later archival releases indicate the true number exceeded 1 million. In camps established in 1945, mortality rates in the first year often surpassed 50%. In some labor detachments, fewer than half of those captured survived to 1950. The causes were systemic, rather than incidental. Soviet logistics could barely sustain frontline units, let alone millions of prisoners. Daily rations for German POWs frequently fell between 600 and 800 calories, far below survival requirements for forced labor. Medical care was minimal. Typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis spread unchecked. Prisoners worked in uranium mines without protective equipment, in logging camps with impossible quotas, and on construction projects where safety was irrelevant. Winter temperatures in Siberia dropped below -40 degrees Celsius without adequate shelter or clothing. Beyond material deprivation lay retribution. Many Soviet guards had lost families to German occupation policies that had killed approximately 27 million Soviet citizens. Mercy was not expected, encouraged, or rewarded. Former Soviet officer Viktor Astafyev later wrote that guards were told every dead German was payment for Leningrad, Stalingrad, and the villages erased from the map. To show compassion was to betray the dead. The contrast between captivity systems reinforced the calculation that had driven the westward flight. Surrender to Western allies meant probable survival. Capture by Soviet forces meant probable death. For specific groups, the disparity was even greater. Waffen-SS members experienced survival rates near 20% in Soviet camps, compared to over 95% in American custody. Female auxiliaries faced systematic abuse in Soviet-held areas, while American authorities generally released them within months. Hitler Youth teenagers were often treated by Soviet forces as ideological enemies and executed or sent to labor camps, while Americans classified them as juveniles requiring rehabilitation rather than punishment. The scale of the American intake overwhelmed infrastructure. Temporary enclosures such as the Rheinweisenlager camps along the Rhine and Elbe held over 1 million German prisoners by mid-May. These camps were austere. Prisoners dug holes for shelter, slept in the open, and endured inadequate sanitation. Food initially averaged 1,200 calories per day, later increased as supply stabilized. Disease spread rapidly in overcrowded conditions, yet mortality remained low relative to Soviet standards. Colonel James Foster, commanding one of the largest camps, summarized the challenge succinctly. We had SS generals beside communists, teenagers beside Stalingrad veterans, women requiring separate facilities, sailors who had never seen land combat. It was controlled chaos, but we kept them alive. Processing revealed the depth of Wehrmacht collapse. Some units arrived with complete records enabling accurate classification. Others had no documentation at all. The once powerful 16th Panzer Division surrendered with 312 men from an authorized strength of $14,000. The 246th Volksgrenadier Division consisted of 89 elderly men. Identity blurred. Were Hitler Youth members soldiers or children? Were female auxiliaries military personnel or civilians? American authorities generally chose the humanitarian interpretation, extending Geneva Convention protections broadly rather than risk abuse. The strategic consequences extended far beyond prisoner statistics. The Western Allies now controlled the majority of surviving German military personnel, granting significant intelligence advantages as post-war tensions hardened into the Cold War. Operation Paperclip, which transferred German scientists and engineers to American programs, succeeded in part because technical personnel had deliberately surrendered to U.S. forces. Werner von Braun and his rocket team traveled hundreds of kilometers through collapsing German lines specifically to reach American custody. As von Braun later explained bluntly, they despised the French, feared the Soviets, and doubted the British could afford them. The Americans offered both survival and opportunity. That decision would eventually put Americans on the moon. The demographic impact was equally severe. East Prussia, Silesia, and Pomerania lost virtually their entire male population of military age. Men were killed in combat, fled west, or disappeared into Soviet captivity. Entire family lines ended. The German Democratic Republic would struggle for decades with gender imbalance created by the loss of so many men. Families divided by occupation zones traced their separation to those final days when some reached American lines and others did not. The psychological legacy endured even longer. For many Germans, survival became associated not with ideology or victory, but with which uniform accepted their surrender. This arbitrary line determined life or death, shaping post-war memory and identity. Diaries and testimonies from former prisoners repeated the same themes. Corporal Friedrich Müller, who surrendered at Tangermünde on May 5th, wrote, "First day without fear in 6 years. Americans gave us bread. Real bread. Guard offered a cigarette. I cried." Nurse Hildegard Schneider crossed the Elbe with a military hospital unit. "We had 300 wounded. Americans took them all, even SS men. Their doctors operated all night. One said, 'The war is over. Now we are just doctors and you are just patients.' I did not know such mercy existed. Even those who expected punishment found something more unsettling." Former SS officer Wilhelm Hartung, later released, admitted he deserved no mercy. Yet Americans treated him according to law, not revenge. That mercy haunted him more than any sentence could have. General Walter Wenck survived the war and lived until 1982. In a 1975 interview, he reflected on his decision to defy Hitler. He stated that his duty was not to a dead ideology, but to living men under his command. Every soldier saved, every civilian who reached safety, represented victory of a different kind. He expressed no regret. Between honor and humanity, he said, he chose humanity. By the time the ceasefire took effect, American forces had processed approximately 1.5 million German prisoners in the final 3 weeks alone. The U.S. Ninth Army reported 423,000 between April 20th and May 8th. The First Army processed 387,000. Fewer than 20,000 were taken in actual combat. The rest surrendered voluntarily, often fighting through their own lines to do so. General Omar Bradley later wrote that the Americans prepared for victory, not for this. The German army did not merely surrender, it dissolved. Men who had fought fanatically for 6 years suddenly cared only about reaching American lines. They knew what we learned later. Surrender to us meant life. Capture by the Soviets meant probable death. Even after May 8th, the movement continued. Between May 8 and May 31, another 874,000 German military personnel reached Western Allied custody through escape, administrative ambiguity, or sympathetic interpretation of deadlines. Some arrived minutes after the ceasefire and were accepted quietly by American guards, unwilling to turn them back. The last documented German to cross near Tangermünde was Volkssturm member Hinrich Fischer, age 63. He reached American lines at 22:47 hours on May 8th, 14 minutes before the ceasefire. Asked why he risked everything, he answered simply that he wanted to see his grandchildren again. He did. Millions who failed to reach the western bank did not. The damaged bridge at Tangermünde was never rebuilt. It did not need to be. Its meaning was fixed in memory. It marked the boundary between two interpretations of victory. One measured success by destruction and punishment. The other, imperfect and overwhelmed, chose survival under law. The German flight to American lines in 1945 was unprecedented. Never before had such numbers deliberately sought specific captivity while still capable of resistance. It demonstrated that even in total war, human calculation could override ideology, and that mercy, however bureaucratic or strained, could shape history as decisively as force. For those who crossed the Elbe in those final days, the gamble paid off with the only currency that mattered: their lives.